Hello and welcome to Paige's Percussion Podcast. For today's episode, I spoke to two friends of mine to get their thoughts about the intersection of concert and marching percussion. First, I spoke with Matt Keown, who has extensive experience in the marching arts, starting from when he was just a little kid learning from his drummer father, who also happened to be one of my teachers growing up, as well as an impressive resume within the concert percussion world. He currently teaches at Purdue University and plays in chamber groups such as the Percussion Collective and the Icarus Quartet. Next, I spoke to Chris Whyte, who spent years playing in drum corps and has continued to teach and arrange for various marching percussion groups, and is heavily involved in the field of concert percussion. He's been teaching at Portland State University for many years and is an active solo and chamber performer. The three of us teach at a marching percussion camp in Oregon every summer, so we've had many iterations of conversations like these, but I thought it would be fun to interview them both in a podcast format and allow us to talk a little bit more in depth about how we merge our concert and marching percussion worlds. I asked them both largely the same questions, mostly to see how their answers and perspectives differed. Big thanks to Chris and Matt for taking the time to chat, and I hope you enjoy. Hello, can you hear me?
What's up?
How's it going?
Oh, I'm good.
Thanks for being willing to do this on such short notice.
Yeah,
Well, that
definitely.
we were literally just texting about it like an hour or so ago, and here we are. So
I was glad that it worked out. Yeah, thanks for asking me.
yeah, the purpose of this interview is this is the first time in many, many years that I haven't been a part of a full marching band season. I taught band camps and stuff before I started the semester, but this is the first time in a decade or more that I haven't been in that scene for kind of the whole season. So it's made me go back to the drawing board on some stuff that's related to marching percussion and just have a little bit of a breather from it and come back with a different perspective maybe, or a fresh perspective. So it's had me thinking more about marching percussion as it relates to concert percussion, what the transfer value is, how they differ, just all of that has been on my mind lately, especially when I do go back to Florida and go to a rehearsal or two here and there. I feel like I'm seeing it with fresh eyes. So I thought this would be a cool topic. You and Chris obviously have your foot in both camps as well. So I thought maybe we could start with you really briefly talking about what your background is in concert percussion and marching percussion.
Yeah, I love to share my story. So I always tell people I was raised as a drumline kid because that's what my dad primarily did for a living and still does to some degree. But he was like a professional drumline instructor, among other things. Like he also ran a publishing company and was a jazz drum set player and was a symphonic player and taught privately, all these different things. But I feel like his kind of claim to fame was always as like a drumline writer and arranger, and then also a drumline teacher. So that's the world that I grew up in, and that's the world that I fell in love with. I started going to a drum camp that he ran in the summer and still runs to this day, but that was strictly a marching percussion camp. And that was my first real taste of what a drumline could be. So that was my first experience with it and got hooked at that point. And for the longest time, that's what I thought I wanted to do. That was going to be my career. I knew who Scott Johnson was and I wanted to be the next Scott Johnson. That was my dream growing up. The only reason that I even started playing other instruments was because my dad knew what it was like to be a percussionist and how to make your living and everything. And he said, if you want to do this and you want to be a drumline teacher, then you need to play mallets too, because you'll be more marketable that way. So I was like, okay, that's the only reason that I started doing that at all. I was a drummer through and through. This was still pretty early. This is middle school-ish that was going on. But yeah, that's where it started. And then fell in love with that side of things by the time I was in high school. So even by high school, I felt like I was balancing these two things of my marching playing and my concert playing. And both of them were things that I grew up with and took really seriously. And I knew that I wanted to at least go to college for percussion, right? And so that entailed learning all of the different instruments. Then as that time went on, I became aware of what some other career opportunities might be and on the concert side of things as well. So that's when stuff shifted. So throughout my undergrad and that time, I feel like I walked my, at least performance on drumline stuff as far as I could go. I finished that all with marching snare drum with the Blue Devils. But the whole time I was this weird situation where during the school year, I was completely focused on my concert playing. So the University of Oregon had this great drum line and marching percussion stuff available through the school. but I actually didn't do any of it. I thought like I was keeping these things really separate from the beginning. It's like during school, I focus on my concert stuff because I need to get my 5 hours of practice in a day. And if I did the marching band, I couldn't get those 5 hours of practice. So I needed to practice. And then in the summers, I'll do my drum corps stuff, and then I'll get the best of both worlds. And then once you stop being able to take advantage of those opportunities and stop playing in drum corps, then I felt myself really have this shift where I moved over to the concert side of things. And my next goal was to walk that forward as fully as I could. So in some ways, started to distance my marching stuff, and even was like led, as I think people who are in this world can feel, to be like ashamed of it. In some ways, it was like a naughty thing that I wasn't supposed to do. Right? That was like that was that low class music playing that music making that I had no part in doing what I was doing. So I really, I stayed involved in it, but it wasn't something that I really talked about that much. And that dichotomy kind of lasted for a long time. So in the meantime, I go to the East Coast and I do the rest of my training in grad school with Robert Van Cise and develop as a solo musician and as a chamber musician. And then eventually I always had an idea that I would try to bring the two things together. And that's what I strive to do now. If those two sides are like my background in marching percussion and in concert playing, like now what I try to do is, one, I try to foster it in my students of being able to do both and bring things that I do from my, like what I learned as a concert musician, bring that over to what I do in my marching playing and my ideologies about that and vice versa. So that's how it all came up separately. And then hopefully now like melds together in some sort of interesting way.
Yeah. So it sounds like for you, it was a very clear, like you started with marching percussion and then concert percussion got added. That was going to be one of my questions was, what were you first invested in? And I figured with you, I thought it was the marching percussion. That makes sense. And you started to touch on some of my other questions too, but I guess I'm curious, what are some specific ways that you approach concert percussion versus marching percussion differently versus the same? Yeah. Do you want to rip on that?
Yeah. Like one of the ways that it started to make the most sense to me was coming up with things that I think work really well in each world and trying to figure out like why those work really well. And so honestly, I think the biggest epiphany that I had was when I started teaching front ensembles, because I never got to do that. Like, and I was always kind of nervous. Like when I had to start teaching front ensembles, it was like, okay, I'm a mallet player. Like I can do this, but I always felt underprepared for it because I had never had that hands-on experience. What does it mean to be in a front ensemble? A little bit of insecurity that I was teaching things wrong because maybe there's this whole world of front ensemble playing that I'm supposed to know things about that's different than what I do. And eventually I was able to talk to some of those people who did have hands-on experience in specifically the front ensemble world and hear their approach to marimba and see like where the overlap was. And I think that in a lot of ways, mallet playing has almost more overlap than the drumming does at times, just not in terms of maybe technical development, but in terms of just like approach to the instrument. So I had to think, what do I do differently? How do I take my stroke in my solo marimba playing? And how do I find a way to adapt that to a front ensemble? Because ultimately, like I believe the way that I make my stroke and the way that I make my sound, like that is something that I've obviously thought a lot about and what I want to have happen. So then how do I do that basically in this different setting? So I had to come up with ways of standardizing what I did because that was big difference that I came up with. A lot of the techniques that exist that people have a hard time latching onto or pointing to as like things that are like wrong or weird in that marching world was they're just there because it's easier to unify, right? I think a lot of the techniques that were coming out of it was just for the sake of finding something that was easily matched. So then I took my technique and was like, okay, well, if here's my approach to marimba playing, how do I do that? How can I like tailor that in a certain way that's going to be easily unifiable amongst all of these different players and maybe slightly more standardized? So I feel like I've reverse engineered my technique in that way to then bring it over to that specific like type of teaching and playing in marching percussion.
Do you feel like maybe there's multiple reasons, but for that reason in particular, that the fact that marching percussion does get geared towards what can we make really consistent and uniform across a bunch of people and how that informs the technique and the playing style, do you think that is a reason why marching percussion can get a bad rap within the concert percussion world?
Yeah. I think from the outside, if you're looking in at some marching percussion stuff, it can seem a bit forced and a bit artificial. And I don't disagree. I can see like the arguments on both sides, which is why I think it's good to be in a place where you can think deeply about your stroke and your sound. And like I was saying, reverse engineer it of how do I take what I hold really important and tailor that to this group. I think the problem is more in like dogma. Like there's a lot of situations. And honestly, I find this a lot in both camps, in my concert focused students and my marching focused students, where they do things because it's the way that it was taught to them. And so this is my stroke. This is how the marimba is played. This is the way that we do it. It's, okay, why? Like, why do you do it that way? And that's normally where the thought process stops for a lot of people. And if you're a young student, like I get it, that marching percussion tends to be a youth activity too. So a lot of students like aren't mature enough to think about that side of things. But the problem is that then it perpetuates to the teachers, because then they might be perpetuating a dogma that they haven't thought about too much and that was just taught to them. But I think it's really important to just think, why is my teacher having me do this? Because for X or Y, there's always going to be a reason behind it. And I think it's actually a really good process to figure out what that reasoning is behind it.
So let's say either you have a student in front of you, or maybe even you're teaching your younger self, for example, someone who has done a lot of marching percussion and is in the concert percussion world. What would you tell them are the key transfer value elements from marching percussion that they should incorporate in their concert playing? And are there things that you would say they should separate and that they should not transfer specifically? What do you think the best elements that we learn from marching percussion are to bring to concert percussion?
Yeah. I guess the most obvious one to me is like technical facility. I don't even want to say technique itself, because technique is specific to an instrument, but like just the general adaptability of your hands. Still to this day, I've never met people outside of the drumline world that just have like as good of facility around any variety of hand patterns that you can possibly imagine. That's like literally what that music making is all about, right? It's being able to do any sort of hand pattern in any possible way at any given speed, at any given dynamic, right? So like you gain this incredible dexterity and flexibility and speed and endurance and everything else that just isn't, I don't think that there's a pedagogy within the concert curriculum that develops that in the same way. The other thing that I think transfers over really well is the learning process and the rehearsal process. I think that you're forced to like engage in a type of rehearsal that focuses on great detail, because you're trying to match sound and stroke and everything else across a bunch of different people. The only way to do that really effectively is to work in microscopic detail. So that attention and that general rehearsal process, while maybe it's not always transferable, because at some point, maybe when we're playing hour-long pieces in the percussion world, we can't maybe work in that same level all the time, but taking things from that and being able to utilize that type of rehearsal and practice strategy, I think is really useful. The last thing that I think transfers really well, at least off the top of my head, would be like ear training skills. There's only been one other person whose rhythmic hearing blew me away more. I didn't know if I would ever meet someone who could hear the details of rhythm more clearly than my teachers did in drumline stuff. And the only other person I met was, I was so blown away when I took lessons with Tom Freer on specifically orchestral snare drum. And I was like, wow, this guy's ears, like the things that he could hear and the detail that he could hear inside orchestral snare drum was on par with those drumline teachers that I'd had. But it is something that seems to be much more developed in a marching setting, because that's what you're doing. You're taking a bunch of people and listening in microscopic detail to align things to a degree that's like kind of unheard of in other types of playing. And then the stuff that I don't think should transfer over, really, it's like people have a hard time with stroke concepts. Like I talked to other colleagues that have marching players coming to their programs. They're like, oh, their stroke is much too downward, or their stroke is way too heavy or too stiff. And all. For me, I feel like those are things you can train out of people. But the bigger thing is just adapting. We should be adapting our stroke and our sound to every instrument. Like, case in point, like I don't play the marimba the way that I play a vibraphone, and I don't play a vibraphone the way that I play a xylophone. So I don't play my marching snare drum like I play my concert snare drum, and I don't play my multi-percussion setup like I play my marching snare drum. So if you really are kind of like developing a well-rounded percussionist, hopefully that changing and adapting of technique is happening on literally every instrument. And so it shouldn't be that big of a deal, but it is a hang up and something that I think we can we can say, yes, you should not transfer that stroke style from your marching snare drum over to your marimba playing. But that's the same thing on really any percussion instrument.
Yeah, that's a really good point. At PASIC, I went to the Sandy and Paul Rennick clinic, and Sandy especially was talking about how she also has experience in the concert percussion world, and she uses that to inform how she teaches her front ensembles as well, and how she encourages them to, in many ways, treat it the same as like her students that are in her ensemble and are percussion majors. Treat it like you're in percussion ensemble, that kind of thing. Yeah. So I guess same question, but reversed. What would you want your students to take from the concert world and bring to marching percussion? And is there anything that you think leave it in the concert world and approach differently?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say that the biggest thing would be really careful listening and handling of musical elements, right? I think that marching percussion can tend to be a very physical type of drumming, but not so much in that it's demanding physically, but we focus a lot on the way things feel, right? This feels like this. The amount of times that I can remember, I think everyone can probably sympathize, is if I'm playing something on my drum pad, and sometimes I'll realize that I haven't really been focusing to myself. I've been thinking about something else, and it still sounded fine, but I wasn't listening, I wasn't thinking, and my hands were able to go on autopilot, and it's because there's such a feel associated with all of that stuff. And in some ways that's good, but I think in that world, people focus too much on the way things feel. So I get that a lot when I'm working with students who come from, I'm thinking marimba solos, and they come from like even a front ensemble background, is they're playing the right hand louder than the left hand, but that's kind of where it stopped. It's as if you could imagine their teacher said, okay, play this hand higher and this hand lower. But the degree to like, how much louder is that going to be? And, or what is the shape within that line? I find that a lot of that stuff gets lost on people when they transfer from one to the other. So I would want people to take that really careful approach to sound and approach to phrase and nuance and bring that over to their marching playing. I think there's incredible room for it. I don't think that there's any downside to listening more deeply and making more careful choices, remembering that those choices might be different because every choice has to be made to the effect of bringing a group together of 4 marimba players playing the same part. So it might not be the exact same choice as I would make within a percussion ensemble, just because the music itself is different and the idiom is different. But I think that you can take that way of listening, way of thinking, and bring that over. As far as things I wouldn't want people to take over from concert percussion to marching percussion, I'd say it's a similar idea. I don't want you necessarily to take that stroke over, being that we're playing on different instruments, we're doing different things. The technique has to adapt a little bit to that style of music as well. But as far as like the sensibilities of the playing, I don't know that there's anything that I shy too much away from. It's just being ready to adapt.
Yeah, I agree. So marching percussion is this interesting phenomenon for us where you age out of it very young as compared to like we could play concert percussion really as long as we want. But it's one side of music that, at least on the performance side, you usually are limited to once you're 23 or so, you have to be done. And I was talking earlier about how I'm observing my perspective changing as I'm getting older, as I have more distance, both from performing myself in marching band situations and even just these last couple of years where I haven't been a part of a full season. So I'm curious, as you've gotten older and as your involvement in the activity has changed, has your perspective on the activity, on the type of music, on the approach, has any of that kind of also been evolving as you've gotten older and maybe become more and more invested in the concert side of things?
Yeah, my thoughts about it have changed quite a bit. I think that it's an amazing educational thing. And what's cool is it's not just for, even at upper levels, it's not just for professionals and future professionals, which I think is very different from what we do. Once you get to a certain level with your concert playing, like you're basically talking about professionals and people, who are maybe about to enter that professional field, which is, I like that side. I like that there's a lot of people invested in music making as members of marching groups that are going to go off and are going to do different things. And there's not that same maybe pressure of turning it into your full-on career one day. The biggest thing that seems to continue happening though, that is, I think, problematic and is the amount of money that gets spent on it. So I was just at BOA last weekend and we're talking like $1 million budgets. It's not uncommon, I think, for those groups to spend with everything like $1 million. And there's something to be said for doing something as good as you possibly can, but where is the limit with it? What can you do with $1 million? You could literally outfit your entire school with private teachers for every single kid by saving that money. So that's the part where I get hung up on. And competition is a good and a bad thing, right? Competition is something that can really motivate you and it can really fuel you and it can push the boundaries of what is, of the performance level. But it also causes you to spend more and more money because it's like this group is sounding this way and they have these electronics. So one way that we can one up them is by spending more and having a greater package or the newer instruments or like a part of our uniform that is different this year than last. And so I have a really hard time with the budgets that are spent on that sort of thing. I think it's a major reason why drum corps are going out of business left and right is because everyone's trying to chase those top 3 groups.
That's a great point on the financial side of things. It is pretty crazy to see an event like BOA, very different than the competitions that my little high school in Utah were part of, where we couldn't afford anything. But yeah, you look at these bands with these huge budgets, or even when I was living in Florida, there, it was a whole different world from what I came from. And there were a lot of pros to that. It was really cool to see. And the level was really high, much higher than how I was playing in high school. But yeah, you're right. It can still come at a cost, and there's some real pros and cons. So I think the last question that I had written down was, let's say you get to completely choose this ideal situation apart from marketability, because obviously I think us being adept in the marching percussion world means that I am employable in some ways that I wouldn't be if I didn't have that experience. I can teach drumline, I can write shows for schools, etc. So beyond just that and the career marketability, speaking purely from the musical side of things, if it were up to you, would you have all of your students be a part of a marching percussion ensemble and concert percussion, or is it more case by case for you?
Yeah, a lot of it is case by case, but I'm leaning more toward that everyone should do both. Just because I think that if nothing else, I can't think of a lot of better foundations, right? I always thought that there are certain colleges that have these killer marching percussion programs, and a lot of the undergraduate students that are coming there to study percussion really came there because of the drumline. Like they happen to be percussion majors, but I just think like, man, what a treat of you don't have to worry about their hands at all. Like they can already play everything. Now, what you have a lot of work to do, obviously, with the other sides of things and how they're going to adapt and be able to do these things. But you never have to worry about the technical side of like, can they execute something? Sound quality and chamber music skills and sensibility, all of these stuff, like what you're going to work on. But that work is just already taken care of. And so I think that having that as your framework is so helpful. It just takes a lot of the problems off the table, and then you can move past it more quickly to everything. So I would I would say that I would certainly lean much more toward I can see the musical value of everyone doing it.
Yeah. Would you say, try to think of how to phrase this question because it just came to me. When you're performing in a big marching band, huge brass section behind you, whatever, big drum line, I feel like performing that music, it always gave me a distinct kind of feeling that was different from even when I was having fun performing in a percussion ensemble or a wind ensemble or whatever. Do you feel the same, or do you feel like it is a real distinct like performance experience, or do you get the same feeling when you performed with Blue Devils that you do performing in your chamber groups now or an orchestra or that kind of thing?
No, it's definitely different.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's pretty drastically different. I always call it the goosebump test. It's rare for me, but I'll get goosebumps in like really intense musical situations. And when they happen, it's some of like the most special moments that I've experienced. And I get them in I think different ways at different times, but I would say that those moments were actually more common in some of my marching playing than they were in some of my concert playing. And I think that there's maybe psychological elements to that. I think there has to do something with, honestly, like timbre and volume, and there's something about that. The most recent experience I had with it was a new Viet Quang piece that we just did with Icarus. And in that entire concert, I got a goosebump moment in it, which was like, I love that there's a piece that I'm playing right now that has that moment. Doesn't mean the other pieces aren't awesome. It just means that there's this big climax in Viet's piece, and it gets me. It gives me those goosebumps. And of course, it's the loud section. It's the groovy section. It's the big thing. And something about that amount of volume and that sound and like that unity, I think is another big part of it amongst the group at that moment, leads to that feeling. And so I would get that feeling quite a bit inside marching percussion stuff. So it's the same feeling, but I just felt like it was still unique, and if anything, maybe slightly even more prevalent when I was in those groups.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think you're onto something with the sheer volume. Like when you're playing outside, rarely does a marching band play super quietly, or at least not for very long. And yeah, it's these like big impact moments, and you're surrounded by sound and other people. There's something definitely to that. I feel like I get different kinds of goosebump moments in these other scenarios, but I feel like most recently, the only time I've had a really similar feeling to what I would get in marching band was this summer when I was playing with a giant steel band. And it was super
cool.
loud,
Yeah.
super energetic, surrounded with people, a similar thing. And then it was like, oh my gosh, in some way, it's like when I was in marching band, and it's just always going to be a little different to me, even with my favorite percussion ensemble pieces or even orchestra, large ensemble stuff. So glad that's not just me, but
Yeah, no, I'm with you. There's something about, the immersion in the sound I hadn't thought about that until you were talking about, like, you're like engulfed in sound when you're in a drumline, because there's literally like formations that are happening. Like people are all around you. You're kind of like in the sound sculpture. So you're experiencing the sound in a really different way. The energy of like other players around you is really tangible. And so when you feel that collective energy that you're talking about with the steel pan group or a drumline or the Viet piece that I was talking about, like you feel it for sure.
I think there could also be something about both in the steel band situation and marching band. We're in a context where it's not just okay, but encouraged to like really outwardly show your energy, and like that increases the hype, body language, facial expressions. In the steel band, everyone's dancing. Like it's a very visual thing too, versus I feel like even in some really cool percussion ensemble or chamber music things, you might show it a little bit, but you might be grooving a little extra, or you might smile, but everything becomes much more contained versus these other contexts. It's like, yeah, go wild and show the audience that's 200 feet away from you that you're having a great time. Maybe
That's a really good point, because I've always really been tied with movement and music together. And I actually credit that with my marching percussion like upbringing, actually. That I think that from the beginning of me getting into music, movement and music were so closely tied together. And I know that when I play even concert stuff, like I'm a very physical player. Like I move a lot. And honestly, if I try not to, it makes me really nervous. Like I feel really inside a box, like I can't get out. So I feel much more comfortable and much more at home when I'm moving. And I don't know. I do have that theory that it's from growing up as a marching percussionist that I have to move. But yeah, what you're talking about, like steel players like dancing while they're doing it's I think a similar response to the music.
yeah.
Totally agree.
Cool. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. And it's great to talk to people that, again, have kind of a similar background in both camps. So it's really interesting to hear how other people are thinking about this, especially as we get maybe less and less involved directly in the marching percussion world. So it was really cool to hear your perspective.
Yeah, thanks for asking me. An excuse to hang out, because okay by me.
Cool. I'll be in touch soon, but have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks, Paige. Yeah.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Hey, I can.
I appreciate you taking the time. Hopefully this will be like a fun chat.
Yeah, totally.
So I thought it would be interesting to talk to you guys that are also very concert percussion heavy, but have a lot of this marching percussion background and kind of, just talk more about your approach and how you mesh the two worlds. Could you first talk just a little bit about your background in marching percussion, your background in concert percussion, just a little bit about how you started in both?
Yeah, sure. I grew up playing piano for many years, and then just like a lot of people do, I got into playing percussion like in sixth grade, and I didn't really have a formal teacher. I was mostly just playing in band at school. And one of my first experiences in high school playing in band was joining the marching band, and actually played cymbals my first year, and I was terrible at it. I didn't know what I was doing at all at the time. None of this stuff exists anymore actually at all, but there was in the 90s, there was actually a big summer circuit of summer marching bands that were similar to drum corps. They had their own kind of touring circuit and things. And there was one here in Portland in the area. I think I went and auditioned for it one year and had no idea what I was doing. I tried to like audition for bass drum and was completely lost. And it might have been like my first or second year of high school. And I was just really out to lunch about it. But, I was practicing a lot with my friends. So I ended up being in that. I was playing the tenors. So I got a little taste of doing a little beyond like the school environment there. And then a couple of the members from that group ended up going up to and being in the Cascade, the kind of local group at the time. And so I was in that ensemble for 3 years. And in the meantime, in that kind of time frame, I also started going to college, and I was in the college marching band for a couple of years too. And I'll come back to all the concert side of things, but simultaneously I was getting underway as a percussion major in my undergrad. And then I was still participating in drum corps in the summers, and I went and I marched in the Blue Coats for a year. I played snare drum there, and then I marched in the Blue Devils for a year and played snare drum there. And on the marching side of things, I think I was always maybe figuring out how to wear two hats at the same time, because especially at the time in the environment I was in school, playing percussion there and all the things we were doing with that, there was a little bit of a maybe like an anti-marching sentiment around from not everywhere, but from some of the teachers and just the environment a little bit and so I was wearing a couple different hats all the time. And so anyway, then after marching in the Blue Devils, I ended up teaching some drum corps for a little while, and I've continued to do a good amount of arranging. I don't get a whole lot of time hands-on anymore teaching. There's a summer marching percussion camp out here that Keown runs that I'm getting a part of for 10 or 15 years now. And here and there, I do get hands-on with some programs that I've been very connected to for a long time. But generally speaking, at this point, I'm mostly doing the arranging side of things. So as far as the concert percussion side goes, as I mentioned, I was playing piano for a long time growing up. And so naturally, when I went to college, I was really drawn to all of it. My teacher at the time, Charles Dowd, was like a really big proponent of being well-rounded and just playing everything and not specializing really. And so I think that was really good for me as an undergraduate. But so, yeah, as I said, I was progressing through that and then through the masters, and ended up really getting drawn to orchestral playing for a little while. And I was taking some auditions and ended up going to Boston University for the DMA and did a lot of it, like kind of intensive work with Tim Jennis there. I think it's, as far as my classical playing goes, it's interesting because I was really in pursuit of a lot of the orchestral playing for quite a while. And then I had some success with it. And then it ultimately just, when I moved back to Oregon, I formed a chamber group and we started doing a lot of playing with that. And I was doing a ton of freelancing for years. And I've always seen it as just a balance of different things. And so that's the background. I guess I'm sure you'll have some more questions about how they affect each other. But yeah, that's a little bit of the background.
Okay, so now starting to talk a little bit more about comparing and contrasting and relating the two worlds. What are there ways that you specifically approach concert percussion versus marching percussion differently? I know that you aren't doing a ton of hands-on marching percussion teaching at the moment, but you have a lot of experience with that. So do you feel like you have your two different sides of the road, or do you see it more as like you have your approach that you just adapt a little bit for the different contexts?
I would say it's pretty separate, I think, for me, because I tend to think of it about playing in a way that's idiomatic, or trying to think about, for any percussion idiom, like what does it really call for? I would consider it like the same as, I wouldn't say if I was like really big into taiko drumming that I would take like the same approach and applying it to xylophone playing or to snare drum, right? And so I think going back all the way to when I was a student and I was marching in drum corps in the summer and playing throughout the year and all this other stuff. I think what I tried to do was, for whatever situation I was in, was like put that hat on and make sure that whatever I was doing, and I still believe in this, that it's appropriate to the situation. Sure, a marching snare drum is a snare drum and a concert snare drum is a snare drum. But to me, I think they're really pretty separate instruments. The way we play them is extremely different, I would say. And I think there certainly are things about my marching background that have helped me in my concert playing in terms of just building the foundation of my hands and maybe a foundation of time and rhythm and understanding of those things. But I do feel like the approach to actually playing the instruments and the sound and the way you approach physicality on all the instruments, to me, I try to keep pretty separate. I think for a long time, I would hear this argument a lot that if you play in marching band, if you play in that style, that it's going to have this detrimental effect on your classical percussion playing. And I guess my response to that would be, I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time, actually, that we can choose when we are playing timpani or concert snare drum, that there's an appropriate way to play those instruments, that we don't have to choose to use the same type of approach that we would in a marching snare drum. And that on the flip side, that playing in a marching setting, I think there's a reason that has a lot of validity to it, why when you see mallet players in marching ensembles, the approach to the style of playing is different from classical marimba playing.
Mm-hmm.
But in a lot of ways, that's because the attempt is to be doing this in unison with multiple players. And so over time, I think that the approach and the techniques to being able to do that effectively evolves naturally to make it possible to do that at a high level. For me, I would say there's elements of the approach to marching percussion that are a big plus, but I wouldn't say it's a direct crossover. Not even close, actually. I try to be pretty upfront with students about that too, that if they're going to do both, that I think they have to find ways to see what the crossover is, but then really set each one aside when they're switching gears.
What about from specifically a teaching side of things too? Would you say that there's a significant difference there if you're teaching a chamber group versus teaching a marching ensemble?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a difference for sure. By nature, I think the marching percussion ensembles, because ultimately the goal in a lot of ways is to get a group, sometimes a large group of humans, to be doing the same challenging thing, in unison at the same time. And so there's a whole approach to the training aspect that goes along with that I think inherently brings about a very structured approach to rehearsing, namely because even when we're talking about the technique side of things and what you need to do in that atmosphere to have a successful group, it often means that the way you play exercises has to be very structured. Essentially, it's not coming from the players, is the way I would describe it. That information, the way, what tempo are we going to play? What are we going to play? How long are we going to play it for? What dynamic are we going to play it at? All these things have to come from the instructor. And actually, I think there really should be a similarity, because as a teacher, no matter what environment you're in, I think one of the most important elements is with students is a sense of trust. And that comes from a lot of consistency in how you approach the environment and then the process and the results that come through that. And so in a marching setting, you have to achieve that through a sort of very consistent approach to how you rehearse. I would say, in a percussion ensemble setting, one thought that comes to mind that I think about a lot is when we're in that setting, at the university, and for instance, if I were to give the students a new piece and say, okay, the performance is 8 weeks out, and we're going to structure the rehearsal so that every week we accomplish something very definite and defined. That is a way to rehearse it that's very similar to how a marching percussion ensemble might be approached. I think that can be effective, but one thing I think a lot about with my students is, how do I want them to be eventually? And not just what I want them to be able to do. And I think with college in particular, a really important thing for me is that over time that the students develop a sense of how to become a professional, like how to stand on their own 2 feet, how to make decisions on their own. And so, in a professional environment, essentially, you're literally never going to get a very clear direction of exactly how much notes to learn before the first rehearsal. 99 times out of 100, it's just an expectation to show up with everything ready. And so I think for me, even though there's a little more messiness in the process in the college setting with percussion ensemble, that I lean into that process more because what I'm hoping for is that they develop a habit of how to be eventually. And I just think in a marching setting, there's too many moving pieces really to take that approach, to take a really, I guess you could say, more hands-off approach to the organization of rehearsals.
Well, and it's interesting to think about too. Something you said was making me think about how in a drumline rehearsal, even if you're learning new music or something, the performers really aren't making any musical decisions. It is all very defined. You could point to any note and you know how many inches to play it. And am I using my wrist or my arm? Like, it is all very defined versus if you're walking into a percussion ensemble rehearsal, even if everyone has their part already learned and prepared, a lot more of the discussion is about the specific choices that they have made personally, like in their touch, how loud they're playing something, which mallets they use, whatever. And so it ends up being at least more so a musical discussion. There might still be like hey guys, you're rushing here, we're pulling apart or something. But the marching percussion stuff ends up being much more about just that perfection side of things, of what is stopping us from sounding like one person playing this very mathematically perfect thing right now. And I think they're interesting, different challenges, but it also, I think, gives marching percussion a bad reputation in the concert percussion world, because I think people see it often as devoid of musicality, or we're just learning how to play like robots or that kind of thing, because it's all hyper defined, because we're trying to replicate it.
Yeah, I think to that point, I was just thinking, like, to me, in a chamber setting, we have a concert coming up in 2 days, and I've been trying to refresh them on this idea the last week or two that when you've been at the same stuff and rehearsing it every week for a while, that it can start to just take on a sameness. Things can lose their edge a little bit. They lose it loses a sense of being in the moment. And ultimately, I think really fulfilling and really engaging chamber music experiences, both for the audience and for the performers, that happens when everyone really is in the moment. And when you do have tangible communication happening musically and otherwise in the performance. I think that's a little bit of a different goal than a marching percussion performance. What I sense from folks who have not spent any time in the marching percussion world, and so they're looking at it from the outside looking in, might not have a true sense of how challenging it really is to get things really locking in together, and to get things really sounding like something approachable, like musically. It's actually a really hard thing to do. And so I just think the goals for me are a little different. I think if you ask the same question about any like rock band, especially, because it's not, obviously not the same as marching percussion, but just to say that like the goals there are not the same as like a classical chamber ensemble either. But you wouldn't necessarily say, well, it's not really music that's being played, or it's not musical in those ways. It's just different, right?
Yeah.
And so I look at it through the same lens as that. And I do think actually over time that what's happening in marching percussion, I think it's really moving a lot more toward what we might consider musicianship in the more classical sense. I think it really is moving a lot more toward that. So
looking specifically at what we can take from the marching percussion world into the concert world, what are some specific elements of transfer value that you have taken from your experience, or that you would want your students who experience both to, what do you want people to bring with them from marching percussion into their concert percussion? And what, if anything, do you want them to just leave in the marching percussion world and not bring to concert?
I think a really solid foundational sense of time and pulse is really, it's one thing I know is folks that I noticed this in myself, and I noticed that students that I've had that have spent a decent amount of time in that world tend to build a more innate sense of pulse and rhythm and subdivision and syncopation and hemiola and all these things that become very important. And maybe there are situations where we don't need to play like really strictly in that same way, but how do we use that to our advantage as like a foundation? That's a big one. I would say technical ability is a big plus. I tend to find that folks who have developed their hands in that way, if we can break a couple of habits that come through marching percussion, that typically they tend to take to things technically much faster. And a lot of that is just simply because I think of the amount of time they've spent literally just sheer repetition of moving their hands and playing basic fundamental exercises. One thing that, in terms of mount playing that I've seen a lot is even just some foundational understanding of some application of theory things tends to happen in that way, because I see a lot more students that have an in-depth understanding of like the circle of fourths and have played all of their major and minor scales and arpeggios and these things. So I would say those things are the big things for me. Things I would what was the other half that I would like hope that they maybe don't bring with them? Yeah, I think like even fundamental things like what is a downstroke? This is one of the cruxes of it for me is what is that and where is it appropriate and where is it not really appropriate? And even how do you adapt that in a concert setting or like in a setting where you're playing multiple percussion, or it's not quite the same as a marching percussion setting. That would say that technical thing is one of the hardest things. I think that's the hardest habit to break. It's just approaching things that way and understanding like, yeah, when you're playing Delacluse, yes, there are times where you use a downstroke, but it's not the same downstroke that you would use in marching percussion. There's an adjustment there, and it's a subtle one, and it's in a bit of a gray area. I think also that the idea, and as I said, I've noticed over the years, this is changing a little bit, especially with mallet playing in marching percussion. But I think like really getting students who have primarily a background in that to really embrace and figure out how to move and play and sound in a very legato way is something that is a challenge. And so there's some habits that come from, I think, marching percussion that are, again, driven by the fact that you're trying to get a whole group of people to do a thing in unison. And when you do that, usually you're trying to take variables out of the equation. You're trying to limit how many things are happening technically and movement wise. And that usually doesn't lend itself very well to like really figuring out how to play with the legato motion and move in a very connected way. And like use rebound to your advantage all the time, like when you're playing timpani or snare drum or whatever. So those are like little subtle things that I think are really obvious that look like, I think to a lot of folks, maybe looks like you're playing harsh. Yes, but if you were in the other setting, then it wouldn't be. Yeah, it's different. So I just try to like broaden their understanding of what's needed for the classical side of things. And also I would say like the volume spectrum tends to have to come down like quite a bit. And so if getting students used to playing like what is really playing pianissimo in snare drum or in xylophone, what are those things actually? And it's just a different world for that. So those are some of the main things.
What about thinking kind of vice versa? What would you want people to take from their concert training into the marching percussion world?
I think there's some things about sound production that are like really applicable. I think there's a lot to take from classical playing into marching percussion in terms of just like the concepts about sound. Like a lot of the concepts that we talk about in terms of playing with a full and dark and big and legato sound, and how do you achieve that? It usually is achieved through relaxation and using the weight of the mouth or the sticks to your advantage and not adding extra speed to a stroke when it's not needed, and not creating extra articulation when it's not needed. And I think that some of those concepts can help a lot, even in the drumline setting, for just allowing them to create a full sound without muscling it without having to put in too much physical effort for it. That's a big one. I think like the idea about communication among a group in a chamber setting is really applicable too. And just there's a ton of crossover there with just developing an understanding of what's happening in an ensemble and being in the moment and awareness of what's going on, listening across an ensemble and those kinds of things. I would say primarily the big one I would say is sound. And like I said, I think that you're starting to see, if you went and looked this year at WGI, I would say like in things like accessory playing, I think you see a lot more influence from the classical side of things. I noticed that you see somebody playing crash cymbals in a front ensemble, or if you see somebody playing tambourine or triangle or castanets or something along these lines, you're starting to see like less and less difference in the approach to those things than you used to. So I think those kinds of things that we think about, like what's an appropriate way to play those instruments, I think that's gradually making its way in there more.
Yeah. Earlier, I was talking about how part of what interested me in talking about this was me having a little bit more of a step back from the marching percussion side of things has just made me revisit my thinking about it and stuff. Do you feel like as you have gotten older and involved in marching percussion in a different way, i.e. not directly performing it, and have become more and more involved in the concert side, has your perspective on marching band, the whole activity, has it changed much? Has your interest in it changed? Has your what you value in it versus what you used to? Has any of your kind of relationship with marching percussion changed post being a performer?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I think now, especially because I'm a dad and I have a 9-year-old son at home, one of the reality checks I think I've had for myself is if you zoomed out of all the high school marching band and all the winter drumline and all of the drum corps, and in fact, high school marching band, I was thinking about this recently. It might be the single largest participatory musical activity.
Mm-hmm.
If you took the sum total of all of the kids playing in high school marching band in just the US every year, you're talking about like tens of thousands of kids doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when I take stock of how many of those folks are going to be going on and doing a music in college, sure, there's probably a decent amount, but I bet the percentage is less than 25%.
Mm-hmm.
And then even going forward to like how many of those folks are going to go on into grad school and go on into a career in music. And I think about when we're asking these questions about, does one affect the other, or was one good or is one not good, and what's the crossover? Those are all important things, I think. But then I think there's another perspective here that in a way, like what the whole thing provides for those tens of thousands of people who are not going to go on and be professional musicians in their lives, and the type of work ethic that it generates generally, and the type of dedication and the type of focus and commitment to being either good or great at something. And I think like the community that it enables, I think those things have a certain power to them. There's a lot of goodness in those things. There's a lot of good. And so a lot of times when we talk about these issues, I think we have to be careful from our standpoint as the sort of guardians of the musical world or whatever we are, that we don't let perfect become the enemy of the good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you took stock of like the kind of enrichment in people's lives that it creates, I think that there's like a lot of value to that. I think when you're in it and you're in the day to day and you're really trying to compare apples to apples about, is playing marching snare drum bad for my concert playing? I think it's missing the point in a lot of ways. It's missing what it really is for. And it's not a bad question to ask. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I think there's a ton of value to ask these questions and continuing to try to find the answers to them. But I do think that it also, there's this other side of it that is important to consider too, that it's not a one size fits all situation. And I think we have to be very careful not to let our idea of perfection be the enemy of the good, because then we tend to also turn people off. I think if we approach something or anything by just saying the way you do that is bad, I think that tends to turn folks off. And I mean, certainly, sometimes I'll see a high school ensemble play a big primetime kind of concert at somewhere like PASIC, and some of the time, it feels like a marching band front ensemble that I'm watching.
And I just saw some of those at PASIC.
Yeah. And yeah, there's like a big piece of me that wants to, can we get in there and maybe tweak some things that we're doing here a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a time and place for that. And then I also think there's a time and place to remember that in that group, that there might be like 2 of those kids that are going to go on and keep doing this in college and try and go on and do this for a living. And guess what? Those 2 probably are going to have enough experiences where they're doing it in a different way that it's not going to only be limited to what they did there. Mm-hmm. But for everyone else that hopefully had a very positive experience and developed all those other aspects that I mentioned, then their relationship to music for their lifetime is different because they had a positive experience with it. And I think it's really important that for somebody who's more educated per se comes in and says, this is all wrong, you're not doing this, then maybe that changes their perspective and relationship to what they're doing. I just hesitate to be too critical of that kind of thing.
Yeah, sometimes it could be easy to be quick with the value judgments on this is better than that, this is good, this is bad, when maybe it can all be good, or even the quote unquote bad parts aren't necessarily bad, but maybe aren't always transferred in the best ways, and it could be a little bit more gray than that. So if let's say you had full control and you had the power to implement exactly what you wanted, do you think as a teacher, would you want all of your students to do both marching and concert percussion? Do you think it would be more of a case by case based on the student?
I think it's really case by case for me, because I think there's some people who are inclined toward it for lots of various reasons. There are others who are not at all for lots of various reasons, and I think that's fine. I think that there's some bigger picture benefits that the people who do it, if they're careful about everything, they get a lot of benefit from it that they can apply in other ways. But I would say the other factor that we haven't talked about too much is that if someone is really involved in the marching percussion side of things, is there's a big time factor that comes into play. Yeah. Essentially, if in any engagement with it, if you're going to be in a college marching band, or if you're going to teach a high school ensemble, or you're going to go be in a WJ group, or you're going to march drum corps, or whatever, each of those things is a little different, but it's usually a pretty serious time commitment. Yeah. I try to be pretty upfront with students that want to do those things about what the time commitment means, and try to work with them a lot on how are you going to prioritize everything to do all of it if that's what you want to do. And I don't see it as like a zero-sum thing where it's all or nothing. Like, if you do that, then you're not going to get better at any of this other stuff. So I think it depends on the person.
Yeah. Awesome. Those were the questions that I had coming into today. But if there's any other specific thoughts that you have on the topic that you want to share, you're welcome to. But those were my talking points.
I'd be curious. How was your perspective changed and kind of away from it for a year now?
I think, again, I still, over the summer, I still teach the UCF band camp and do auditions there. We do Allen's camp. I do some camp and stuff like that. So I'm not fully out of it, but I think for a while, I used to be really conflicted about, should I have tried to do drum corps or indoor? I did marching percussion in my high school marching band, and it was a very small, not very good band that we had there. And then I did Oregon marching band during my undergrad for all 4 years, which was great. It was a lot to balance with my school major, and I never did summer marching stuff. I didn't do drum corps. I didn't do WGI. And again, we age out really quickly. And I was like, am I going to regret not doing that while I maybe have the chance now? And even up until pretty recently, I was like, I wonder if that was a mistake, because even when I've gotten into some teaching on the marching side of things, and you meet new people that you're going to teach a camp with or whatever, a lot of times people have asked me like, what group did you march with? Or did you do drum corps? And sometimes it comes up and I almost feel like me saying that I didn't do that. Do they think I'm less qualified for these jobs or whatever? But I think on a bigger scale now, I'm okay with not having done that. And I think there are many DCI and WGI groups and shows that I enjoy and think are good. There's also some elements to that side of the activity that I don't connect with and that I feel like I wouldn't have been able to feel authentic doing. Like it is much more showy. And I think I really like the college marching band balance of you get to play in a big drum line and a big band, and that's really fun. And a lot of the hype is still there, but the type of stuff you're playing, the occasions you're playing at is a different vibe. And I think that is more my style than the really performative, more like quote unquote artistic approach that these other sides of the activity have. And I'm not going to name groups or anything, but I feel like even as recently as a couple weeks ago, I would watch like an indoor group and I'm like, I'm actually cringing a little bit at some of the performative stuff that I'm like, if I was the instructor, I wouldn't be the right person to help them get better at that side of things. And so I think I'm learning more about what elements of marching percussion I connect with and what I maybe don't as much. And I feel like here at Michigan too, I've been exploring more like what type of music do I like? What type of percussion do I like? What excites me? What do I think is boring or not really like my thing? And I think as I'm learning more about that, that's also showing me, even on the marching side, what do I like and what do I not connect with as much? And so I think that's been interesting.
I've had those similar kind of experiences like in the last 5 to 10 years too. I think it has, as you said, it's become more performative in that way. And it's almost like it's become a thing unto itself. If you only were in that world, maybe that all works and makes sense, all of it. But yeah, there is something where if you have an awareness of a lot of other performing arts and you see it, sometimes it takes on a little bit of inauthenticity.
Yeah.
I was thinking about one other thing actually that I didn't mention before, which is interesting that I've noticed this fall. I have this freshman who's been doing some of that for a couple of years. I think there's a cultural thing in the marching percussion world, which I actually like, which I've noticed that this student has been bringing into the studio here, which is, I think there's more of a culture in marching percussion of, hey, let's get the practice pad out and play on this together, or hey, check this out. What about this? And in a way, just in the cracks of the schedule, like day to day, basically just comparing notes on things like, hey, what do you do for this? And I think it's a little more culturally maybe part of the marching percussion side of things naturally, that in a lot of percussion studios doesn't necessarily always happen as naturally. I overheard on the hallway the other day that a couple of them were comparing notes on chairs on stickings and stuff. But I think that whole moment started with, I don't know, he was playing some parallel thing or I don't know, some thing. And he was like, oh yeah, this is what that is. And then they just started veering left and started talking about this other thing. And I think there's a really nice sort of like communal, like collaborative thing that happens there when it's like, hey, let's just play this together. What's that all about? And I think if we have our classical hats on and we're more just in our own worlds of, I have my part for this piece and I have my solo music I'm working on, there can tend to be a little less of that going on. So yeah, that can be nice.
It can happen really organically in the marching side of things too, because at any given point, you at least have the people in your section where I have the exact same part as these other 8 snare drummers. So it's very easy to be like, hey, you want to play this together? And you get into the classical stuff where we're all working on our own stuff. And so it can be easy to put the blinders on. Yeah, it's like at any marching percussion rehearsal on a water break, there's like little pods of people playing together, working on stuff and helping each other get better. Because it's also like an ultra team effort where if there's 8 snare drummers and 7 of them are playing super clean and can hit a roll consistently, but one of them can't, the roll's bad no matter what you do. And so let's try to get you up to speed versus it can be like, percussion ensemble, we all have different setups. We're all doing different things. Sometimes you feel like I'll stay in my lane.
Yeah.
It can be a different vibe for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess closing thoughts, I feel like as I've gotten older, I just look at the whole thing a little differently now, maybe than I used to. And I try not to be too forceful in my thinking in either direction. Because I think when I step back and recognize that there's lots and lots of people doing lots of different things out there and this is just one of them. And remembering that our classical percussion little niche is like extremely small too.
Yeah.
Extremely small. I think we forget sometimes how small it is.
Yeah. And as I get more and more into new music too, it's sure I or the person next to me could pass judgments on the way this drum corps is doing things, but I'm also like scraping a gong and rustling some paper, and people will laugh at what I'm doing. Whatever. It's like to each their own. If you're enjoying it, if it's fulfilling to you, if it's meaningful to you, like whatever. Who am I to say what
Totally.
one is better than the other? Cool. Yeah, this is a great conversation, and I appreciate you offering your perspective and making the time to do this. I know you're busy, and
Yeah, thanks for the invite, and it's fun to chat about this stuff. And yeah,
Yeah.
talk to you soon.
yeah.